Another difference between the gamete production between males and females is that females produce gametes in monthly cycles. If you think back to the male gamete production, we said that there's staggering levels of development or stages of development at any one time happening in the seminiferous tubules, which means that at any time millions of sperm are ready to be released at any one time. But however, in females, gametes are produced in monthly cycles, and these monthly cycles are called menstrual cycles because they are marked by a 3 to 7 day period of bloody uterine discharge, which is known as the menses or menstruation. And these menstrual cycles can actually be subdivided into 2 separate cycles. So menstrual cycles can be described firstly by looking at the changes that happen in the follicles of the ovary, and this is referred to as the ovarian cycle. So as we just saw the different follicles in their phases of development and decline within the ovary, that is the changes of the menstrual cycle, specifically pertaining to the ovarian cycle. And then the menstrual cycle can also be described by looking at changes that take place within the endometrial lining of the uterus. Because remember, we said the endometrial lining, the innermost lining of the uterus, consists of glandular epithelium, of which the thickness changes throughout the menstrual cycle. So by looking at those different changes in the thickness, we look at the uterine cycle as part of the menstrual cycle. So in the next few slides to follow, we'll look at these 2 subsections of the menstrual cycle separately, and then we'll bring these 2 cycles together and see how they overlap and correspond. So we start off by looking at the ovarian cycle. So the ovarian cycle is composed of 3 different phases, the first of which is the follicular phase. So during the follicular phase, that is when the follicles are growing and developing within the ovary. Now, second phase is ovulation. So once one or more of these follicles have ripened or matured, the ovary then releases the oocytes during a phase known as ovulation. And the third and final phase, or the phase of the ovarian cycle which follows ovulation, is the luteal phase. And during the luteal phase, there's transformation of this ruptured follicle. So the empty follicle which doesn't contain the oocytes anymore because the oocyte has been released. So this ruptured follicle is transformed into a corpus luteum. Now the aim of the corpus luteum is to secrete various hormones which then aim at preparing the uterus for pregnancy, because essentially the body's role or purpose for releasing an oocyte or an egg is for reproductive purposes. So the corpus luteum will then aim to prepare the uterus for pregnancy, for if there is fertilization of this egg. But if there is no fertilization and thus no pregnancy, the corpus luteum will then stop functioning after about 14 days. And then the entire ovarian cycle begins again, starting off with the follicular phase, so the growth and development of the follicles. So this picture basically just demonstrates what the ovarian cycle looks like during its phases of follicular development and maturation, and then ovulation, which is the second phase, and then the luteal phase, which is the phase after ovulation. So we see that during the follicular phase, there's a primary oocyte contained within a primary follicle. Then we have a secondary follicle, but still containing a primary oocyte. And then by the time the follicle has ripened or matured into a tertiary follicle, the tertiary follicle contains a secondary oocyte. And if you think back to the diagram that we did on meiosis, the secondary oocyte means that the chromatids have separated, but there's cell division arrest, because only once ovulation takes place and that secondary oocyte is released and then fertilized, then does the completion of the second meiotic division take place. And then what is left of this ruptured follicle is then converted into a corpus luteum, which then later turns into a corpus albicans. Okay, and then we move on to the uterine cycle. So besides for all of the changes that are happening with the follicles and the eggs within the ovary, there are certain physiological changes which are taking place within the uterus, and these two physiological cycles are happening at the same time, so they correspond to one another. The uterine cycle also has 3 phases, and it's important to realize that it's actually the ovarian hormones which are regulating the changes throughout these phases of the uterine cycle. So the ovarian hormones play a very important role, and that's also why we say that although we look at these 2 cycles independently of one another, we need to remember that these 2 cycles are happening at the same time, and actually the ovarian cycle, or the hormones of the ovarian cycle, are controlling the changes that are happening within the uterine cycle. So phase 1 of the uterine cycle is menses. So during menses, that's when menstrual bleeding from the uterus occurs, and menses corresponds to the beginning, so the very first or the initial part of the follicular phase in the ovary. Second phase is the proliferative phase. So during the proliferative phase, it does exactly what its name says, proliferation, so increased cell number. So there's thickening of the endometrium, so there's addition of new layers of cells to the endometrium. And this proliferative phase corresponds to the second part of the follicular phase within the ovaries. And there's this proliferation or thickening of the uterus wall in anticipation of pregnancy. And then the third and final phase within the uterine cycle is the secretory phase. So the secretory phase happens after ovulation. So after ovulation, that's also when we have the development of the corpus luteum. And it's actually the hormones from the corpus luteum which then convert the thickened endometrium. So it was thickened in the proliferative phase, but now during the secretory phase, this thickened endometrium is then being converted into a secretory structure. But if no pregnancy occurs, this secretory endometrium isn't needed anymore, because basically the entire structure of the uterine wall is being changed to accommodate, in anticipation, the fact that it's going to have to aid in the development of an embryo. But if there is no fertilization that has occurred, so no pregnancy has occurred, all of these layers of the secretory endometrium are then lost in menstruation as the cycle then starts again. So it's an ongoing cycle. And also the secretory phase then obviously corresponds to the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. So just a visual representation of the different phases of the uterine cycle. We can see the changes that the endometrial lining of the uterus undergoes. So as we said, menses. So menses corresponds to, remember we said, the early part or the initial part of the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. So during menses, you can see there's the sloughing off of the walls, decrease in the thickness of the endometrial lining, and that's also what causes the bleeding. Then during the second part of the follicular phase, we have the proliferative phase. So now there's the building up of the endometrial lining wall again. There's the thickening of the wall, and then during the secretory phase, which corresponds to the luteal phase after ovulation, this thickened endometrial wall is then turned into a secretory structure. And as I said, it's turned into the secretory structure in aim of preparation for pregnancy. So the glands within the endometrial wall are busy coiling, and there's increased amount of blood vessels. Certain glycogens are then inserted, and lipids are deposited in order to provide nourishment for the developing embryo, etc., etc. So the secretory phase takes place in aim of anticipating a possible pregnancy after ovulation has occurred. So the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle follows the basic pattern of the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, or the HPG axis, just as with the hormonal control of spermatogenesis. But it's important to realize that the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle, although it follows the same basic pattern, is a little bit more complex. So there's gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and then the gonadotropins are released upon the stimulation from the gonadotropin releasing hormone. From the anterior pituitary, the gonadotropins are then released, and then from the ovary, there's release of estrogen, progesterone, inhibin, and anti-Müllerian hormone. But in the following slides, we'll have a look at the interplay between these different hormones and the effect on the menstrual cycle. So this is just a basic overview of the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle in all of the different phases. So it's been split up into early to mid follicular phase, late follicular phase, early to mid luteal phase, and late luteal phase. But in the slides to follow, I'm going to look at each one of these phases separately and try and explain them and the influence of the ovarian hormone on the entire process and ovulation, etc. Okay, so we're taking this step by step, and we start by looking at the early to mid follicular phase. So during this early to mid follicular phase, gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is initiating the production of both gonadotropins, FSH and LH. But FSH, remember, is the acronym for follicle stimulating hormone, and its name comes from the fact that it's FSH which causes the stimulation of the follicles in the ovaries. So it's under the influence of FSH that a certain group of primary follicles within the ovary then begin to mature. Now, as these follicles begin to grow and mature under the influence of FSH, their thecal cells, so the thecal cells are under the influence of LH. Thecal cells then start to produce steroid hormones, and the granulosa cells under the influence of FSH start to produce estrogens, whereas the thecal cells produce androgens. So both cells under influence of the specific gonadotropic hormones produce steroid hormones. But in addition to the steroid hormones that the granulosa cells are busy producing under the influence of FSH, granulosa cells also produce anti-Müllerian hormone. So anti-Müllerian hormone is produced because what it does is it decreases the follicle sensitivity to FSH in order to prevent the recruitment of additional primary follicles once one group of follicles has already started developing. So what we're saying is that follicle stimulating hormone is responsible for initiating one group or a certain subset of primary follicles to start maturing. But once that subset of primary follicles start maturing, they then start releasing anti-Müllerian hormone so that the sensitivity of the other remaining follicles are reduced so that more follicles aren't starting to develop or starting to mature. Okay, and as the thecal cells under the influence of LH produce androgens, these androgens then diffuse to the neighboring granulosa cells. And the granulosa cells contain the enzyme aromatase. Now, if you remember from the picture that we've looked at with cholesterol as the primary or the parent molecule, cholesterol is then converted by various enzymatic steps and reactions into the different steroid hormones. And androgens are converted into estrogen by means of the enzyme aromatase. So the granulosa cells contain aromatase, so that the androgens, which then diffuse from the thecal cells to the granulosa cells, can be converted into more estrogen. So basically, estrogen is gradually increasing because the granulosa cells are secreting estrogen under the influence of FSH, and the thecal cells, which produce the androgens, those androgens are then converted by the granulosa cells into estrogens. So that's how the estrogen level then starts to increase. And this increased estrogen level then has several effects. So firstly, an increase in the estrogen level causes the initiation of the negative feedback. So negative feedback is initiated, which means that the gonadotropin release is being inhibited. So FSH and LH is being inhibited. So this also prevents the further development of the additional follicles within the same cycle. So basically within a certain cycle, or from the start of a certain cycle, there's only one subset or one group of primary follicles that go into maturation. And the next thing that happens is that at the same time, this increased amount of estrogen initiates a positive feedback loop on the granulosa cells from which they are being secreted. So in other words, even though the FSH and the LH are both being inhibited because of the negative feedback, because of the increased estrogen, because of the positive feedback that the estrogen is causing, it means that the granulosa cells are being stimulated to release more estrogens despite the fact that the gonadotropins are being inhibited. So basically, this positive feedback caused by the increasing levels of estrogen allows follicles to continue estrogen production even without FSH and LH. Okay, so now we move on to the late follicular phase and ovulation, but we start off by looking at the late follicular phase and how it leads up to ovulation. So as the follicular phase nears its end, the ovarian estrogen secretion peaks. So we can see with the estrogen concentration here in the diagram, the estrogen secretion peaks. So it reaches a peak. And at this point, there's only one follicle that's still developing. The reason for this is that during each stage of follicular development, the follicles are undergoing hormonally regulated cell death, which is known as atresia. So usually, there's only one dominant follicle that actually develops to ovulation. Now, as the follicular phase ends, the granulosa cells of that dominant follicle then begin to secrete inhibin. And progesterone is also secreted. And estrogen, now which had previously initiated or exerted a negative feedback onto the gonadotropin releasing hormone, now has been switched to a positive feedback. So when estrogen reaches its peak and reaches a certain level, the negative feedback is then switched into a positive feedback. So this leads to the pre-ovulatory gonadotropin releasing hormone surge. So there's no indication on the graph of the level of gonadotropin releasing hormone, but just before ovulation, there's a surge of gonadotropin releasing hormone. There's also increased pituitary responsiveness to gonadotropin releasing hormone. So LH secretion then increases dramatically. We can see that there's an LH surge. So there's dramatic increase of luteinizing hormone secretion. But FSH also increases, as we can see over here, but not as much because of the inhibin, which is being released by the granulosa cells. And the inhibin then initiates a negative feedback on the follicle stimulating hormone. So it means that the high estrogen output from the granulosa cells then initiates this positive feedback on the gonadotropin releasing hormone. Gonadotropin releasing hormone then initiates the release of luteinizing hormone, causing a surge of luteinizing hormone, but to a lesser extent a surge of follicle stimulating hormone, because follicle stimulating hormone is being inhibited by inhibin, which is released from the granulosa cells. Now this LH surge is a very important part of ovulation, because without the surge of LH, the final steps of the oocyte maturation won't take place. And about 16 to 24 hours after this surge, ovulation occurs, and then the egg is then released and swept into the fallopian tube to be either fertilized in the fallopian tube or to die. This LH surge or peak in LH release, luteinizing hormone release, is also what causes the luteinization of the thecal and the granulosa cells. So basically the cells that are left over in the ruptured follicle after the ripened oocyte has been released, they are then luteinized or transformed into luteal cells. So initially, if you look at the concentration of estrogen and inhibin, initially during the luteal phase, these two concentrations start to decrease. But as you have development of the corpus luteum then starts to produce estrogen once again and also produces inhibin. But you can clearly see that progesterone is the dominant hormone of the luteal phase. So although estrogen does start to increase again, it doesn't quite reach the peak that it reached before ovulation. So basically, progesterone is the dominant hormone of the luteal phase. Now, estrogen and progesterone at the levels that they are present here, they induce a negative feedback. So the positive feedback is then switched back into a negative feedback. Okay, and then we move on to the late luteal phase. So the corpus luteum, which then develops during the first part of the luteal phase, has a lifespan of about plus minus 12 days. So if pregnancy does not occur, this corpus luteum then spontaneously undergoes apoptosis to become an inactive structure called a corpus albicans. So as the luteal cells degenerate through this process of apoptosis and becoming a corpus albicans, the progesterone and the estrogen that were produced by the corpus luteum are then reduced. So estrogen and progesterone production is then decreased. And this decrease in the estrogen and progesterone reduction then obviously removes the negative feedback signal that previously was exerted on the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So the negative feedback signal that came from the estrogen and the progesterone is now released. And with the release of this negative feedback, it means that the tonic secretion of the gonadotropin releasing hormone can continue, which means that the gonadotropins can then be produced as per usual. So the FSH would then start to increase again, and new follicles will start to develop under the influence of FSH, and LH, luteinizing hormone, would also start to increase. Okay, so then if we put everything together in one graph and we look at the levels of the gonadotropin hormones, the ovarian cycle, the ovarian hormone levels, and the uterine cycle, then we see how all of these different facets of the menstrual cycle come together. So during the first part of the follicular phase, so during early to mid follicular phase, so this is day 1 to about 7 of the menstrual cycle. Day 1 is determined or day 1 of menstruation is determined because it's the first easily observable physical sign. So that's why it's considered day 1. So at the level of the uterine cycle, there is menses taking place, or bleeding is taking place. There's sloughing off of the layers of the endometrium. During the ovarian cycle, during the early follicular phase, we can see the development of the follicles from primary to secondary follicles, and this is under the influence of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. We also see, if we look at the ovarian hormone level, that estrogen levels are starting to increase, and it's due to this rise in estrogen levels that menses stops. So if you remember from what we did in the previous few slides, why does estrogen increase? Why does estrogen start to increase? Well, because these follicles are maturing in response to follicle stimulating hormone. Remember that the granulosa cells of these follicles secrete estrogen, and that estrogen released from the granulosa cells has a positive feedback loop back onto the granulosa cells which are producing them. So in other words, the positive feedback loop is causing estrogen levels to rise. And menstruation then ends during the early follicular phase under the influence of this rising estrogen from the developing follicles. So you can see that from here on, as we move to the next slide, you'll see that the endometrium then starts to thicken again. Okay, so during the late follicular phase, which corresponds in the uterine cycle with the proliferative phase, as I just mentioned, you see the thickening of the endometrial wall, and this is due to this escalation in the estrogen levels, remember, which is caused by that positive feedback. And this escalation in estrogen levels, positive feedback, also causes the surges of LH. So luteinizing hormone surges, but FSH increases to a lesser extent because of inhibin. So inhibin is busy inhibiting the release of FSH, while these peaked levels of estrogen causes a positive feedback loop on the gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then just before ovulation actually occurs, the cervical glands produce copious amounts of a thin stringy mucus, and this thin stringy mucus then facilitates the sperm entry. And this increase in the estrogen hormone levels in the late follicular phase will then prepare the uterus for possible pregnancy to follow. And then moving on to the early to mid luteal phase, as we look at the phases of the ovarian cycle. During the early to mid luteal phase, there's an initial decrease in the estrogen levels as well as the inhibin levels, but as soon as there's this development or complete development of the corpus luteum from this ruptured follicle, then these levels start to increase again. So estrogen levels increase and inhibin levels increase, but progesterone remains the dominant hormone. So with estrogen at this level and not at this peak anymore, the positive feedback that was just induced by estrogen on the hypothalamus to produce more gonadotropins is now switched back to a negative feedback. So luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone then drop back to their normal levels. Gonadotropin release is also inhibited by this increase in inhibin. So that's another factor leading to the increase, or this increase in inhibin is another factor leading to this decrease in the gonadotropin release. Now, under the influence of progesterone, if we look at what this does to the uterine cycle, under the influence of this dominant progesterone, the endometrium continues to thicken and it prepares for pregnancy by becoming the secretory structure, because remember, this early to mid luteal phase corresponds to the first part of the secretory phase during the uterine cycle. So as I mentioned earlier, the endometrial glands start to coil, there's an increased number of blood vessels, the endometrial cells start to deposit lipids and glycogen in their cytoplasm, thus providing nourishment for if there is a developing embryo which is to be implanted while the placenta is developing. Another thing that progesterone does is this increasing level of progesterone now causes the copious amounts of thin stringy mucus that we just said that occurs during ovulation. This thin stringy mucus is then turned into a thick cervical mucus because of the increased levels of progesterone. So this thick cervical mucus then serves as a plug that blocks the cervical opening, thereby preventing the entrance of a bacteria as well as sperm from entering the uterus. And if we look at the basal body temperature over here, another thing that this surge of progesterone does is it increases the basal body temperature by about 0.3 degrees Celsius, because progesterone is a thermogenic hormone, so it has thermogenic ability and it increases the basal or the core body temperature. Okay, and then during late luteal phase, so plus minus, we said, remember, plus minus about 12 days after ovulation, the corpus luteum, if no fertilization has taken place, the corpus luteum dies. So basically the progesterone and the estrogen and the inhibin that were all produced by the mature corpus luteum, all three of these hormones, these ovarian hormone concentrations, will then start to decrease, because the mature corpus luteum that was producing them has now undergone apoptosis. These cells have died and it's now become an inactive corpus albicans. So all of these hormone concentrations then start to decrease. You can also see a slight increase in the FSH and the LH concentrations, because now the negative feedback that came from these concentrations of estrogen and progesterone, that negative feedback is then stopped, meaning that the normal or the tonic secretions of gonadotropin releasing hormone has continued, so that the normal secretions of FSH and LH can continue. Now at the level of the uterus, what does this mean? So what does this mean for the endometrial lining? Well, with progesterone levels decreasing this rapidly, it means there's no more progesterone left to keep on maintaining this secretory structure which has been formed in the secretory phase. Because with decreased progesterone, it means that the blood vessels then start to contract again, which means that there's no oxygen or nutrients that are providing these newly formed cells of the endometrial layer, which means that there is cell death of the surface cells. So after about plus minus 2 days after the corpus luteum has died, or 14 days after ovulation, that's when the endometrium then starts to slough off its surface layer again, which means that we've come full circle and we have now moved back into menstruation. So this is menstruation. So basically just take this part of the diagram and then add it back on over here, and then proceeding with the rest of the cycle. That's why it's called a cycle, because then the whole cycle continues again. So we have the start of the follicular phase of the next menstrual cycle. So just as the androgens control the primary and secondary male sex characteristics, so does estrogen control or influence the female sex characteristics. So the primary sex characteristics, so in other words, the prominent sex characteristics which distinguish females from males, that is under the influence of estrogen. So the internal sexual organ and external genitalia development and differentiation, that's under control of the estrogens. and then also the most prominent secondary sex characteristics, so the other traits which then distinguish males from females, is also under control of estrogens. So these include breast development and also fat distribution, and female body shape, because females' general pattern of fat distribution differs from males. Females generally have wider hips and larger upper thighs when compared to males. But then the androgens, which are produced by the adrenal cortex, actually control the other secondary sex characteristics, such as the pubic and axillary hair growth, as well as the behavioral sex characteristics and sexual drive, such as libido.